Welcome to rSlash where OP destroys the life of a cheating preacher. I spent about 10 years teaching high school humanities at a small private school. For my first 2 years, I didn't have a classroom, just a small office. I would bring what I needed for each class on a cart and go from room to room, depending on which teacher had a prep at any given time. This was incredibly inconvenient, and not being the most organized of teachers to begin with made things difficult to keep track of. There were a group of 11th grade boys who decided to make things a little more difficult for me. They were good kids, we got along well. I coached several of them on the school soccer team. But they decided that since my office would often be empty, it was a great place to prank. It was never anything too serious. Things falling over when I opened the door, or things disappearing for a day and then turning up in a different place the next day. Nothing was ever damaged, and I could never prove who it was, even though I knew. My school had mandatory final exams in each academic course. I didn't really think they were necessary, so I would generally make them pretty easy with a lot of preparation. I would give out study sheets and play review games for a couple of weeks before the test, and there was no reason the students wouldn't do well on them. I had admin approval to do this, as they weren't particularly fond of the final exam rule either. It was a school board policy. A few nights before the offending boys had their exam, I had a brainwave. I created a second exam. Gone were the multiple choice questions and obvious things from the review sheets. In their place came detailed questions about concepts that were briefly mentioned in class. Essay question after essay question. Ambiguous questions with no clear answers. Definitions of words that there was no way they knew. It took a couple of hours, but I laughed the whole time. When the test came, I had the special exams at the bottom of the pile and handed them out to each of the 4 or 5 boys. I told my vice principal what was happening, and he insisted on being present. I started the timer and watched as the boys flipped over their papers. It was all I could do to keep a straight face. Eyes went wide, heads were shaking. Panic was setting in, especially as they saw other classmates flying through their exams. One of the boys raised their hand. "Sorry, no questions during the final. You should be prepared based on your study sheets." I let them go on for about 5 or 10 minutes of terror before I gathered the fake tests and gave them the real ones. They all passed with flying colors and never pranked my office again. It was glorious. OP, I genuinely love this story. Usually on Prorevenge, you get stories of people like ruining other people's lives, but this is actually bizarrely wholesome. Our next Reddit post is from Do Not F with Fatty. Due to the well of my friends, definitely not an axe murderer date recommendations drying up, I've turned to that most sacred of modern relationship institutions, online dating. As a very busy person trying to get it in with other very busy people, I prize honesty and directness above all else when it comes to profile creation. I include full body shots in my photos, try to minimize the use of MySpace angles and selfies, and write at the very top of my summary/caption/profile that I am fat. Not curvy, not thick, not lots of love. I'm effing fat. I'm not ashamed of it, but I also know that weight is a deal breaker for lots of people. I don't want to waste anyone's time. About a year ago, I met Evan via Tinder. We exchanged friendly messages for a few hours one night and agreed to meet up for drinks the following evening. I waited for a full hour past the designated time, and just as I was getting up to leave, the text started rolling in. "I can see you sweating from here. How long does it take you to roll out of bed every morning? Is there an earthquake, or are you just getting up for more pretzels?" Really idiotic, juvenile stuff. 4 separate numbers, commenting on things like my clothes, which clued me in that the senders were nearby. This went on for 15 minutes before I finally saw Evan trying to hide in a corner table and giggling with a group of his buddies. I made eye contact, saw that he saw me, and then walked out. The text kept up until I blocked the numbers a few hours later. I ran into Evan about 3 weeks later. We got onto the same elevator, and he tried really hard at being super interested in the emergency phone instructions. I confronted him, and he admitted it was just some game that him and his friends play. He knew I was fat before agreeing to meet up. They all did, because that's what they do. Meet up with fat women, then either ghost them or troll them at the meetup. It was also kinda obvious he'd never seen any consequences from this BS, as he was sweating pretty hard and looked more humiliated than I felt. I just said whatever and walked out, expecting to never see him again. About a month ago, some local foodie wrote a great review of the restaurant I own, and we've been slammed ever since. In the past, I stayed mostly in the kitchen, but I've been doing more and more front of the house stuff lately. And Valentine's Day, I was working a bit of a split between the two. I saw Evan just as he was pushing in his date's chair. My name isn't on the restaurant, and he didn't see me. I checked the section up at the hostess stand and saw that one of my favorite old-timers, Nan, was going to be his waitress. I went to the bar till, took out $400, put it in her hands, and said, "This is going to be your only table for the rest of the night. You're gonna make this the worst date he's ever been on." She spilled every single thing she brought out to the table all over him. I was waiting for him to blow up on Nan, but he bottled it up, obviously trying to make a good impression on his date. She seemed like a perfectly lovely lady. I told Nan to make sure everything was good for her and terrible for Evan. She poured ice water on his dick, she smacked the back of his head with the edge of a tray, spilled soup on his shirt, dropped every fork he asks for. I personally oversalted his food, used the terrible liquor for his drinks, used flour instead of sugar on his dessert. To be honest, I don't know why he didn't just walk out. He must have really wanted to passionately hug this woman. Finally, he cracked, demanded Nan find the manager and bring her out. I was only too happy to emerge from the kitchen with my chef's hood and say what I'm not ashamed to admit I'd been planning out all night. I would have said hi earlier, but I didn't want the earthquake to disturb your dinner. I will savor the look on Evan's face for the rest of my life. He was a little too flummoxed to explain, so I pulled a chair up to the table and introduced myself to his date, Amanda. Told her how I met Evan. Showed her some fun old messages. Then I gave her a voucher for a free meal on our next visit and told Evan to get the F out and never come back. He deleted his Tinder profile. OP, I'm really glad you got revenge and that Evan got a taste of justice. But man, Amanda just had the wildest date in history. Our next Reddit post is from Caldra. And the setup on this story is pretty long, but man, the payoff is incredible. I've been a computer technician for more than 15 years. I've worked on all kinds of computers, everything from tiny point-of-sale computers to large rack server computers. I'd been attending a church that was new to me. I was trying to date a woman there. This church was her idea. That relationship crashed and burned, but that's a different story. It was about 5 years ago. I had just sat through a long sermon about generosity and giving to those that need help. At the end of the sermon, Pastor Bob asked for an additional donation because the church's roof needs repairs, and it would cost $20,000. That's right, 20,000 freedom dollars for a new roof. After the service, I'm talking to my date. Pastor Bob walks over to me. I said hi and he introduced himself. We talked a bit and Pastor Bob asked what I do for a living. I tell him I'm a computer tech with a shop. As I'm telling him, I have a feeling he already knows what I do. Pastor Bob asked me to have a look at his laptop. It's running very slow, so I agree. I turn the laptop on and I hear a clicking noise. This clues me in that it's probably the hard drive, but I still can't access the data. This is a good thing because it means I can properly recover the data. So I tell Pastor Bob the hard drive is dying and it needs to be replaced. I also tell him I can probably recover the data. Pastor Bob asks how much it would cost to fix. I tell him for most people I would charge around $250. However, I feel I can donate my time, so I would just need $60 for a new hard drive. Pastor Bob agrees, so I write up an invoice. New hard drive, $60. Labor, $0. Data recovery, $0. And 2 to 4 days for repair. Pastor Bob signed the invoice. Thus, I take the laptop to my shop. I open the laptop. HP, why do you use so many screws and clips? I get the hard drive out and connect it to my recovery rig. I set up the recovery to clone the data to a new hard drive, but not the new one for the laptop. A high-end storage drive. I go home after locking up the shop. Next day, Monday, I open the shop and check the recovery rig. It's working, but it'll take at least 10 more hours, so I start work on the other tickets. Then at closing time, I lock up and go home. Next day, Tuesday, I've had Pastor Bob's laptop for 2 days. I open the shop and check my recovery rig. The good news is that the recovery completed 100% data recovered. The report says the hard drive developed to many bad sectors. Now I have a choice to make. I could put in a 1TB hard drive or a 120GB SSD, each for $60. Or I could pay some money myself for a 240GB SSD for $100. I decide why not and put the 240GB SSD in the laptop. I then clone all the data over from the new recovery storage drive to the new SSD. An hour later, the clone is done. So I check everything. The laptop works great and is exactly like how it was before the first hard drive died. Even the login still worked. Therefore, I call Pastor Bob and tell him his computer is done. He says that's great and he'll be there soon to get it. About 45 minutes later, Pastor Bob walks in. I show him his laptop is working much faster. He loves it and signs the pickup form. He then pays me with a check for $60. It's important he paid with a check. I do a bank run on Monday and Friday, so that Friday I'm at the bank. I'm informed that Pastor Bob's check is void. What? Why? Pastor Bob had placed a stop payment on the check. Consequently, I called him and he ignored my call. I go to church on Sunday. Pastor Bob gives a sermon about not lying. I walk up to him and he avoids me. So I leave and decide I'm going to write it off. I spend $100 and some time to do something nice. A few weeks later, a customer walks in looking for a new computer. To welcome him, I offer him a drink and go over his options. I'm chatting him up and he tells me he's a contractor. He mostly does siding and roofing. He's thinking about offering solar, that's why he's getting a new computer. I ask him how much a new roof costs. He says up to about $10,000. So I ask him why someone would say it costs $20,000 and he had no idea. I thought it was strange, so I asked about the church. The contractor said that would have been simple and around $5,000, and he could probably do it for less. The contractor buys a nice new laptop. Something about what the contractor said bugs me later. Why would Pastor Bob lie and say it's $20,000 for a new roof? And why would he stick me for $60? I then remember I never cleared the recovery rig storage drive. I check, and there it is, Pastor Bob's laptop data. I look around because it's slow and I'm all caught up in repair tickets. He had all of his logins stored in a folder on the desktop, including his online dating logins and online poker. Did I mention Pastor Bob is married? I start printing his online dating messages. I look back and find Pastor Bob has been passionately hugging several women from his online dating. He'd been paying for his dates from the church's donation fund. I'm getting angry now. Then I realized that he had passionately hugged the woman I was dating when I was dating her. It was then I decided to break Pastor Bob. I printed out all his dating messages and the women that he passionately hugged for the last 6 months, except I refused to print the naughty pictures. It was an impressive packet. I then decide I need copies of the packet. Therefore, I order 100 packets printed from a major online printer. A few days later, my order of revenge packets arrived. These revenge packets are amazing. Double-sided, staple-bound with a cover with Pastor Bob's face on it. Now the conclusion, and I think it's worth it. The church had a calendar of what the sermon might be about, and a perfect Sunday was approaching. I go to church that perfect Sunday. I show up a bit late. Everyone's in the church, so I put a revenge packet on each car. I have a few revenge packets that are in yellow envelopes. Fittingly, I put them in the mail. I sent one to all the higher-ups in the church, and I sent a special packet with some of Pastor Bob's naughty pictures to Pastor Bob's wife. I set the return address to the church. I also emailed a bunch of people the revenge packet from a burner email. A couple of weeks later, I went back to the church. Pastor Bob was gone, so was the wife. Several of the women were also gone, including the one I was dating. I asked one of the important people there what happened. The answer was amazing. I was told about the revenge packet and how everyone had gotten one the day my revenge packet appeared. The sermon Pastor Bob had given was about the evils of adultery and cheating on your wife. Thank you, church calendar. The fallout. Pastor Bob was fired and shunned. Multiple women from the church have not returned, including the one I was dating. Pastor Bob's wife is divorcing him, and she's the one that owned the house and cars. No longer a pastor, Bob is now being sued by several people, including the one that fixed the roof. He never paid any of them. There were also rumors of a criminal case for embezzlement. No one has seen Bob in a while now. The church might close if they can't find a new pastor. But the church's money is very low. Apparently, he also spent over $30,000 on online gambling. Man, that pastor really should have just spent the $60. Our next Reddit post is from Harry Monk. Background: years back I worked for a large bank in the UK. We all worked on the same floor and in the same department, but within different teams. I was just passing through on a secondment and saw the beginning of this revenge, but was filled in on the aftermath later. One of the teams was run by a woman called Sarah. Sarah was, by many measures, a good manager, but she had a blind spot. That blind spot was a woman called Helen. Now, when I was in my previous role, I interacted with Helen a fair bit, and she had seemed friendly. But when it came to actually working with her, she was a nightmare. She'd tattle, steal ideas and credit, and generally throw you under the bus at any opportunity. I'm not sure why Sarah always protected her, but it soon became a sore point for most people on the floor who had to deal with her. Enter Mike, who was the manager of a smaller team. Mike could be a bit of a dick, but was still professional and fun to work with. To give you an idea of his character, I found out I was being made redundant, and even though he wasn't my manager, he heard about it and booked time out to help me with my CV and do interview practice. Shortly after, it was announced that Mike's smaller team was being dissolved and the staff either made redundant or moved to other teams. At the time of the cuts, the economy in the UK was in a bad state, and all the banks were looking for efficiencies. He was redeployed and took the vacant manager role under Sarah that Helen had been gunning for. To make matters worse, Helen now reported directly to him. Helen was furious and spent no time in making her discontent known, as she felt she was entitled to the promotion. Unfortunately for her, Mike was wise to her. They'd both joined the company around the same time, and so he knew exactly what she was like. He'd even had her blame him for mistakes before. Hell, even the project she'd gotten so much praise for had been work one of his staff had done. So he started the process of documenting her poor work and attitude to manage her out of the business. Sarah, however, would not allow it. Helen was a high performer in her eyes, and she wouldn't sign off on him getting rid of her. When I left the team, Mike was frustrated with her and wasn't sure what to do. The revenge. I met up with Mike a year later, and he shared how he solved the Helen problem because he knew all the issues I'd had with her. Because Sarah kept his hands tied, his only other option to get Helen out of the team was to have her leave of her own accord. He couldn't oust her by making her life difficult, or she'd go to Sarah, so he went the other way. This mother effer sat through every performance meeting with her for the rest of the year, gritting his teeth and praising her. That then justified him giving her a really high performance rating. He also used his contacts to find roles in other teams at his grade, and he talked Helen up to them. These roles were specifically selected because they specialized in one of the things Helen claimed she was an expert at, but had very little real experience in. Basically, roles where he knew she'd have the highest chance of the bed. Eventually, she applied for one, and he spent several weeks coaching her for the interview. In that company at the time, the interviews were scored off of three main factors: performance rating in the current role, competency based on interview results, and relevant experience. He'd done everything he could to make her shine in all three. She took the promotion, and within 2 months had quit the bank. He knew she wasn't ready for the responsibility, didn't have the skills, and her poor work ethic would be exposed. Worst case, she'd get her act together and he'd still look like the perfect manager to Sarah. That was rSlash and if you like this video then hit that subscribe button because I put out new Reddit videos every single day.